Hello, everyone, and happy Tuesday. Here we are again on America, Some Assembly Required. Anna is not going to be joining us today. She has some um, engagements that she needs to do with Jim today in his recovery. And so we're going to be talking about the rest of our 1787 Constitution. So we're going to dive right in and try to get some things done today. If you've missed the last two presentations with the earlier halves of the 1787 Constitution, we're reviewing this because our international business assemblies really need to understand what are their duties and what are our constituted or contracted that we have delegated to others. So as we go into and begin to work our governments as we stand up, that we know what side of the fence we're supposed to be on and what other people are supposed to be doing for us, our service providers, meaning the United States of America Incorporated and its affiliates. And so today we're going to continue on. We just have a couple more articles to go. And then we're going to talk about the Bill of Rights as well after that. So just some fair warning, we're probably going to have to change times for next week. We're not sure when that will be. I'll try to get it posted as quickly as I hear from Anna when we're going to change times. It may also require changing days. So just a heads up, please stay engaged, still stay following, and we'll continue on in our learning and educating about the International Business Assembly as it applies to each of our states' assemblies. Okay, so today we're gonna finish up the last of this Constitution. We're on Article 5 of the 1787 Constitution. And the Constitution reads, the Congress, Article 5, the Congress, wherever 2/3 of the houses of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, meaning us organic states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article, and that no state, without its consent, shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. Well, that's a lot of words. and we have to begin to understand what that really means and why they were doing this. So the intent was to provide a structured yet a flexible way for constitutional change. That's what Article 5 is about. They knew that as they grew and as the United States matured, added more states in the Northwest Territories, that change was going to be needed and necessary. And if there's one thing even our assemblies today can count on, that's change. Change happens rather quickly sometimes, and sometimes it happens rather slowly. Our founding fathers intended us to change and grow, expand, and mature in our thought and in our ability to do business. They knew our nation would be a great nation one day. And so they provided for that change within Article 5. They wanted to balance the popular sovereignty with institutional stability. They didn't want chaos to reign throughout just because there was going to be a change or an addition to the Constitution. But they also knew that the people, the popular sovereignty, that they wanted to have a stay in this. They did not want to be lorded over. That's what they came from. That's what we came from in England. And so popular sovereignty refers to the direct delegates of the people, direct presentation from them. And so they wanted to make sure that Congress had the ability to propose changes, and the people also had the ability to enact change as well. So they wanted to prevent excessive rigidity in either direction, or, in many ways, reckless addition or alterations that we see today in a corporate Congress. So it's one of those things that they, in this Article 5, they wanted to make sure that those things were kind of the body and the intent of what Article 5 was. Under the historical context, Article 5, under the Articles of Confederation, the amendments required unanimous consent, which was nearly an impossible standard that paralyzed any reform to the Articles of Confederation. Think about our own assemblies today. And if we had to get 100% consensus of everyone, we would never get anything done. And we've all experienced that within our assemblies. And so the founding fathers thought it was really wise to protect the Constitution, protect the process, and for the people to have a say and protect the people, that they put in these guidelines towards 3/4 vote to be able to make changes. And we will always have naysayers among us. There's always going to be a small majority of people who are going to say no. And so we have to provide for that in many ways, or at least our founding fathers found that way to be the way they wanted to protect their Constitution. So there's two paths to propose amendments to the Constitution. The first one is a congressional proposal, and that's a higher standard. So it takes 2/3 of, or actually not quite as high as the other. It takes 2/3 of both of the houses to pass any kind of a congressional proposal for an amendment to be placed out, to be voted on. And then the Convention of States. So that's called by Congress upon the application of 2/3 of the state legislatures. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is they would have to have 2/3 of the state legislatures agree to call a convention of states. And that convention of states then talks about the proposals from Congress to the amendments that they proposed. That convention of states could go ahead and call for a vote on those amendments, place them on their ballot, and then the people would have the ability to weigh in and vote on that directly. Realize that we've had a lot of talk in the last 15 years about convention of states. A lot of people are very much for it. However, in the current climate where we really don't have a delegation of the de jure government ready to go, it's really not a possible happening that can take place because the people really have no direct vote or voice in the corporate incorporated government that is in existence today. And so it's kind of another one of those smoke and mirrors, sort of like the Republic of the United States, where they can't do that without the de jure side of our governments being stood up and being out of interregnum. It's why it's so important for our assemblies to assemble their states and get their states standing so that, we have the ability to stand up and say and push back against something that would be unjust in an alteration of amendments. It hasn't exactly stopped them. So, as we go through and we begin to see some of the things that they've amended the Constitution to, especially the latter after 1863, the Civil War, we'll be able to see exactly some of the things that they've done within the Bill of Rights. So there's really two paths to ratify amendments. And it takes the approval of 3/4 of the state legislatures or approval by conventions by 3/4 of the states. So in this Article 5, it also mentioned a couple of protections. And our founding fathers were really wise about making sure that we had protections within our Constitution, so that couldn't just be either lobbied away or just proposed away, recklessly proposed away. So they basically said no amendments could be had before 1808 that would affect slave trade clauses. Now, this was a compromise to appease Southern states. The founding fathers, most of them, even though some of them retained their slaves, they were actually very magnanimous to their slaves. Some paid their slaves. Of course, they would provide them good working conditions and housing and food, and even houses of prayer and education for their children. There was nothing more that some of our founding fathers wanted than to free their slaves, but it put the slaves in such jeopardy that they would not push that at that time. They knew that they could be re-enslaved, and they would not be under the types of conditions that our founding fathers wanted for them. So no amendments before 1808 that would affect any of the slave trade clauses, just to appease the Southern states, because otherwise the goods, the cotton fields, the sugarcane fields, all of those things that were being used in trade would not have been possible, and it would have significantly stopped business and international business in the developing world here on the Americas. So the second protection that they put in was that no state could be deprived of equal suffrage in the Senate. So what is equal suffrage? So what that meant is that every state had the same number of votes in the U.S. Senate, regardless of its population, wealth, or size. You see, some of the more populated states at that time wanted to have more vote because they had more population. That was their argument. But our founding fathers found that would seriously penalize the smaller states that were developing, and today still would very much penalize small states like New Hampshire or Wyoming, or some of the states, New Mexico, that have a much smaller population than, say, California or New York, or even Virginia and Pennsylvania. So specifically, this guaranteed 2 senators and each senator to have 1 vote that emanated from their state. And they couldn't do anything without the consent, which preserved the Great Compromise. Now, they talk about the Great Compromise of 1787, but that resolved a major dispute between large and small states, because the small states were very worried about being overwhelmed by the large states. We have that same concern still today when it comes to when they were voting in their presidential elections. California, New York, Massachusetts, Virginia, they all make up a majority of the voting population. And so it could have very easily caused the fact that certain factions would get into power, and there would never be a real vote that represented all of the people. And so we have to realize that our founding fathers were really wise in what they were doing in terms of making sure that there were protections within. And the large states, and at that time Virginia was a large state, wanted representation based on population. But the small states like Delaware, that's still a small state today, feared that they'd be overpowered and demanded equal representation. So having 2 senators from each state was the great compromise. And the compromise also created what they called a bicameral, or 2 separate houses of legislature. So the House of Representative, and representation being based on population. So this is part of the compromise. And then there is the Senate, which was equal representation, meaning that there were 2 senators per each state. So that bicameral representation was something that allowed the representation from different segments of our society. So a wealthier state or a wealthier area would not have more say than an area that had a lower economic or a less educated population. So it was really important in the compromise that they began to talk about and think about how those how it was going to work into the future. It was almost as if they could see in the future and see the future issues that were going to be happening with some of our larger states like California to the west, developing, populating, becoming overwhelming in many cases in their vote, or a highly densified population like New York. So Roger Sherman, who was a delegate from Connecticut at the time, argued that everything depended on this, and that smaller states would never agree to a constitution without it. And remember, they had to get 3/4. So it was going to be really important that they work towards consensus, which is also a nice lesson for all of us on our assemblies. We are required to work towards consensus. We have to sit back and weigh the pros and the cons of all the arguments and seek to find that middle ground that we all can live with, work with, and move forward together with. Our founding fathers had no different challenges in theirs. I mean, there are talks of fistfights and duels, and at the time they're cursing upon people within their government. It was passionate for them as well as for all of us. But one thing that the Great Compromise teaches us is that there can be the ability for us to begin to find what is the common ground between us, and how do we normalize what we do in our assemblies to what our founding fathers did within their structure and governance. So we have to be always on our toes in terms of being able to get towards what I always called the win and the win. Both sides win. They have to give up maybe a little bit, but in the long run, they both win. And so Article 5 really speaks to this thought and philosophy of each of our assemblies really beginning to win, and in a federalist kind of situation, being able to normalize that business so that all the states can do business together. Okay. So Article 5 really embodies what they consider federalism, commonality among all of the union of our states, both the national and the state governments, and it's federalism in the terms that it can initiate change from either direction. We're not just gridlocked into what is going on. And it also reflected a prudence of the time, that change was possible, but only with an overwhelming consensus. They're really trying to gather in the opinion of the people and make the best judgments they could. And it really took an opinion of everyone. And this is another lesson for our assemblies. I always say that we have a vote and a voice. And this is where our voice is really important, and our right to a vote is preserved. So that prudence is really important. You don't like what's going on in your assembly, you have two options. You can use your voice to prefer out the compromise that needs to be made. Sit back and think about, where can you go with that? How can I negotiate this? And it is about negotiation. What can you give up and what can you accept? But it also means that we're going to take and we're going to listen to the other side and work that into our proposals. It's not a, this is the way it is, but heads, right? And our founding fathers in this great compromise are teaching us that lesson of what we need to do to get our governments up and actually working. Did it please every one of them? No. But was it the right thing to do? Yes. And that's where then not only did their voices count, but in some cases where they felt discounted in their voice, that's where their vote counted, right? And so within the assemblies, there's always, and I'll coin the phrase, there's always something to vote against. There may not always be something to vote for. And so when something is not really presenting itself well to us and not allowing us to present to it, this is where our vote comes in the General Assemblies and within our International Business Assembly. So keep that in mind, that our founding fathers set a heck of a bar for us. And this reflects their prudence in being able to make changes, but doing that prudently with a majority of the votes involved. And then it also anticipated us in the whole consideration that future generations were going to correct flaws. They knew it wasn't perfect. They knew that as time went on, conditions might change, and we would have to change our constitutions to go with it. And they did not want any kind of real revolution because of it. Even though there ended up to be that civil war, they really did not want to have that occur for all of us. And so they provided this vehicle through Article 5 to be able to enact change without revolution. Okay. So Article 6, and we're going to dive into that one. And so Article 6 states, all debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, and anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding. The senators and representatives before mentioned, and the members of the several state legislatures, and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution, but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. So this article really speaks to what's considered the oath and supremacy clauses. And so this is the intent, was to ensure a lawful continuity, national supremacy, and religious neutrality. This is where the concept of freedom of religion really is cemented within our constitutions. So let's take a little historical look at what that means. The new Constitution replaced the Articles of Confederation, but the debts and treaties of the old regime needed honoring to maintain the international credibility. If they'd have just said, "Up, sorry, we're going to create a new constitution and see you buy debt," we're declaring a debt amnesty, basically, or we're going to just run out on our debts, that would not have served the United States well, and probably would have led to war between Spain, France, and England upon us as well. We would have been back under war conditions. And so in the Constitution, in this Article 6, they made sure that all prior obligations remained valid. So the debts of our Revolutionary War were carrying through here into this new Constitution, and they were substantial for the time. So the Supremacy Clause was basically a direct response to chaos under the Articles of Confederation. They weren't perfect. And so this is where the states often ignored federal directives. So they looked at that and they said, well, we're sovereign states. They can say anything they want at the Confederation, and we don't have to follow it, right? Sometimes I hear that about our own federation now from some of the assemblies. And so understand that in this Constitution of the United States, that basically they made sure that the Constitution, the federal laws, and the treaties override state laws. And you might say, well, why is that? Because, our states are supposed to be our national jurisdictions. Our counties are basically, our states are our nations, and our counties are our national jurisdictions, and they can just about override just about anything, right? Well, not when we have delegated representatives or a delegation or electors who present our state's wishes as a whole. And so this was the agreement that they all signed in the Constitution, that when there was federal law or there was a treaty that was decided and agreed upon by the Continental Congresses, and so that all states would follow those particular either laws, directives, or the treaties that came out of that Continental Congress. So then the oath clause. Anna always says we don't take oaths, and there it is right there in our Constitution. What the heck, right? But it also says affirmations, which is what our assemblies are going to be doing, is they're affirming public law. They're affirming their adherence to that public law. And so the oath clause and no religious test clause, they were kind of revolutionary at the time, because they rejected the European models that tied office holdings to religious conformity. What kind of things did they make them conform to? Well, this was part of the European religious persecution that they all went through. Part of the reason they left Europe and came to the Americas. They were exclusionary laws, and And so it was a direct response to centuries. So all officials had to swear to uphold the Constitution or affirm to uphold the Constitution. And anyone or anything that was repugnant to that Constitution, it was held and pointed out quite well that it was repugnant, disgusting in its concepts. And so how that formed was in England, the Test Acts, which was the Corporation Act of 1661 and the Test Act of 1673, and they renewed it in 1678, and it required all their public officials to swear allegiance to the Church of England. It also denied Catholic doctrines like transubstantiation. For anybody who's Catholic, you'll know what that is. Or it required them to take Anglican communion within a set time, staying in communion with the church, right? A loyal subject of the church. Little did they know that the Pope was still behind it in the Catholic Church. And so there was one of the drafters of the Constitution. His name was Oliver Ellsworth. And he called these tests cobweb barriers that excluded honest men and rewarded hypocrites. So that was kind of give you a little bit of the local flavor of how disgusting that was to our founding fathers. There were some state level religious tests in early America. So even in the colonies, many of the states had religious tests. Delaware in 1776 required belief in the Trinity and the divine inspiration of Scripture. And in Maryland in 1776, they required that you had to believe in Christianity. In Massachusetts in 1780, they required belief in a Christian religion. And in North Carolina in 1776, it barred anyone who denied the Protestant religion or divine authority of Scripture. And Pennsylvania in 1776 required belief in one God and divine inspiration of the Bible. So you can see how this varied very much, and often the tests were used to exclude Catholics, Jews, deists, and non-Protestants from public office. So they were really exclusionary, and our founding fathers really found that very difficult to negotiate within the government itself, and felt that all people, remember, they said all people are created equal. And those people had a right to their government. And it means that, they put no requirements on participating in the government, whether or not you had any kind of religious affiliation or held certain beliefs. Right on down to today, when we might deny somebody the ability to be in there because, let's say, they make a marriage requirement, or they make a requirement that you have to have a business, or you have to own land. Those things are long gone in American politics and in American thought. So our founders rejected some of the first beginnings of that in terms of their oath and their oath clause and their religious test clause. So religious tests were really used as tools of persecution, and it really resulted in sectarian control of the government. And our founding fathers really feared that a dominant sect would monopolize power and suppress others. We see that somewhat today, don't we? In some of the shenanigans that are going on within our government. And so there were a few really famous quotes. There was a Baptist minister of the time. His name was Isaac Backus. Religion is ever a matter between God and individuals. No man can impose any religious test without invading the essential prerogatives of our Lord Jesus Christ. And then there was a Supreme Court justice, or a future Supreme Court justice, James Iredell, who warned, under the color of religious tests, the utmost cruelties have been exercised. So they had seen where in Europe those religious tests really had interfered with development of righteous government, just and lawful government. And so, that was basically, they wanted that out, and they wanted to make sure that that was in the Constitution to keep it out. You see, there was no separation of church and state in any of these constitutions. There was no establishment of any religion, and this is what it came from, was the Article 6. So they chose to make sure that no religion could be established within our government, and that government remained a government, a melting pot of both religious thought and individual freedom. So they really made sure that colonial America didn't exclude or persecute or control any other types of religion or religious activities within this clause, and especially made sure that it didn't invade our government and become the pervasive thought and to a point of persecution from our government. So this was really, really important clause within our government, and it really established a secular governance, which was a real radical departure from some of the European norms of government. But it also reinforced the unity and accountability across all levels of our government. So really important clause, and we have to kind of read through the gobbledygook and the language of the time to realize what it really says within the article. So if anybody tries to establish any of those things, you can point back at Article 6 and say, no, we don't do those types of things. We don't put those qualifications. They put age qualifications, they put citizenship qualifications, and that was it. Okay. All right. So Article 7, and we're going to get into Article 7 here. And we're coming down to the end of our Constitution. So Article 7 says that the ratification of the Convention of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states, so ratifying the same. And then it says, done in convention by the unanimous consent of the states present the 17th day of September in the year of our Lord 1787, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 12th in witness thereof, we have hereunto subscribed our names. And so, hold on just a minute. I'm going to pause for a second. I think my computer needs to be plugged in. There you go. All right. So with Article 7, this is ratification. And it goes on, and it has the signers on here. But then it goes on down a little bit past there, and I'm trying to negotiate a couple screens here, but Article 7 goes in. You'll see the signers here. But down here at the bottom, it goes into the ratification of exactly what they mean by ratification. So it says that the preceding Constitution be laid before the United States in Congress assembled, and that it is the opinion of this convention that it should afterwards be submitted to a convention of delegates chosen in each state by the people thereof, under the recommendation of its legislature for their assent and ratification, and that each convention assenting to, meaning agreeing to, and ratifying the same, meaning the Constitution, unaltered in any state, should give notice thereof to the United States in Congress assembled. Resolved, that it is the opinion of this convention that as soon as the conventions of 9 states shall have ratified this Constitution, the United States in Congress assembled should fix a day on which electors should be appointed by the states which have ratified the same, and a day on which the electors should assemble to vote for president. Let me change your page here. And the time and place for commencing proceedings under this Constitution. That after such publication, the electors should be appointed and the senators and representatives elected. That the electors should meet on the day fixed for the election of the president and should transmit their votes, certified, signed, sealed, and directed as the Constitution requires, to the Secretary of the United States in Congress assembled. That the senators and representatives should convene at the time and place assigned. That the senators should appoint a president of the Senate for the sole purpose of receiving, opening, and counting the votes for president, and that after he shall be chosen, the Congress, together with the president, should without delay proceed to execute this Constitution by unanimous order of the convention. Of course, George Washington was the president of that convention at the time. So this is the beginnings and the makings of the college and the Electoral College. And it defined out a process by which it was going to make sure that the people had the ability to weigh in on the final ratification of the Constitution. This is where your vote was supposed to come in. And this is where you were supposed to be represented in that vote. So with the ratification, it defines really the threshold for a legitimacy of a new constitution. They couldn't just vote it in themselves. They had to have people to ratify it along with it. And they also made sure that they were breaking from the unanimity requirement of the Articles of Confederation, meaning that they had to have that there wasn't didn't have to be unanimous in its vote, that only 3/4 were needed to ratify this Constitution. So the Articles required that all 13 states had to agree to the amendments, the Articles of Confederation. So Rhode Island was famously stalled in progress. So any amendments, Rhode Island just kind of dug their heels in and and didn't ratify, didn't vote, which held up any changes to the Articles of Confederation. So the framers chose a 9 out of 13 states, or 3/4, as sufficient ratification, ensuring momentum while disrespecting dissent. So they didn't fight against dissent necessarily. They just created a vehicle that they could work with that went around the dissent, that says, okay, well, we're looking at a Republican form of government, and that means that everyone has a direct vote, and that's fine if you want to dissent. But we're also going to put this rule, or we're going to put this threshold, this quorum threshold in it, so that 2/3 of you can ratify this without being blocked by one state. So the Constitution became binding upon the ratification of 9 states, and the ratification occurred through state conventions, not legislatures. And it's very interesting because when you get a little bit further into why they did ratification through state conventions, it was to keep the legislatures from politicizing those votes. Although today they do, in the college of the Electoral College, have quite a substantial political influence within the delegates and electors that go there. So within this Article 7, it really embodies the consent of the governed. This is where you were supposed to be able to vote, and your delegate to the state convention was supposed to carry your vote to that state convention, not their vote, and have the obligation to vote the way whatever their county voted. And then those votes were tallied up, and whatever those votes were is what our electors were supposed to present at the constitutional conventions, or in the vote of the issues themselves. And so a little bit haywire when politics and 2 parties got involved, because we have to remember that to begin with, we were one party. We were one collective thought, one assembly in its issuance. So they really tried, the founding fathers, to make sure that the consent of the government took place. And it really demonstrated the pragmatism of the framers, try to avoid paralysis that they experienced during the Articles of Confederation. And it also set a precedent for constitutional legitimacy through deliberation, and not through force, not through revolution, not through military, or not through religious persecution. Okay? So this whole Article 7 is where our voice, our vote, is cemented within the American system of governance. So just to kind of sum up what we've just went through with this Constitution, Articles 5 through 7 really reflect the framers' deep understanding of governance as a living system. You hear a lot of times out in the media, oh, that Constitution, it's old, it's not living. They call it a living document, but it's not. Well, this is the living section, Articles 5 through 7, and they can't deny it necessarily, which is why they've never been able to do a constitutional convention. And in many ways, they've not been able to really, truly ratify anything. What we have to remember is that after our delegates, the Southern delegates, walked out in 1861, that the quorum was actually lost of the organic states, of the people. And within our Constitution, the consent of the governed was lost in that. So everything after that, they had to put into incorporation, basically, to go forward, because otherwise they would not have been able, they would have been completely stymied in being able to govern. And so they went forward, but none of the amendments after the 13th Amendment that was ratified by basically our Congress, the Congress of the people, under this particular Constitution, nothing after that is actually ever lawful. It's legal, but it's not lawful. And I'll remind you again the definition between what is lawful and what is legal. Legal is taking something that is unlawful and making it legal. All right. So they're basically blessing it because they want it and they need it to carry out whatever flair of business that they want. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. Okay. So Article 5 ensured the ability to adapt to future conditions and to the future of the United States, and the changing of times and people and the growth of our great nation. Article 6 asserts unity and secularism. So Article 6 really says that we have a way to normalize what we do between our states, and that the states all agree that when we're in a full Congress, that whatever is decided then by those delegates, electors, to our House of Representatives and to our Senate, that's going to apply within the states, which is why the federal government can say this is a law, but it has to be written into the actual congressional record, into the federal record, before it can actually be enacted on the states themselves. And then secularism, meaning that we're ensured a freedom of religion, but we're also ensured that no religion will take over in thought of government. And it's also why Sharia law is so vehemently opposed, because it is a religious law. And that's part of also some of the pushback that's happening right now in New York City, with the election of a Muslim mayor who guarantees Sharia law rights. So that's a real important item to keep watch on right now, as to how that actually plays against the Constitution in terms of its constitutionality of some of the things that he's actually proposing at this time. And then there's Article 7, and it legitimized the Constitution through democratic consent. So yes, it's democratic consent in the fact that it's represented from the people. In our states, we have a Republican form of government. At the federal level, it's democratic in terms of the ability to have representatives place the vote. Okay, so let's make sure that we keep those two things straight, because in our states, that Republican form of government is a simple majority of what we want. And in the federal government, municipal and federal governments, it becomes a democratic. That's why you hear the mockingbird media always say, oh, this is a threat to our democracy. Because they're afraid we're going to impose our Republican form of government and our ideas and reassert ourselves with our Republican form of government into their system. Okay. So our founding fathers were not just crafting a government, but they set a framework for self-correction, course correction, integrity, lawful integrity, and also legitimacy in terms of popular sovereignty. And it was really a radical experiment in republicanism. And it still shapes our lawful, legal, and philosophical debates today. So when we listen out there in the news and you're reading some of those media articles, you need to keep all of this information in mind. It colors the way you see and you hear what they're talking about. So this last passage before the Bill of Rights was known as the closing resolutions of the Constitutional Convention. And it really laid out a procedural roadmap to make sure that the newly drafted Constitution would be ratified and implemented. Ratified by whom? Well, by the consent of the people. And so once they had drafted this new Constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation, and those articles had proven too weak to really govern effectively. And so the Constitution was just a proposal, and it had no legal force until it was ratified or agreed to by the people. So, it's a real interesting thing to keep in mind about the difference between the Articles of Confederation. They were a great first draft in a way, but they were unworkable in many other ways. And so it really wanted to preserve the flavor that we, the people, were in charge and that we had a voice and a vote. So that was your first 1787 Constitution. So as we go through it, we're going to be challenged with some of these same types of issues in our assemblies. And this is a great document to be able to draw back on and be able to look at and say, what our founding fathers have done, right? How would they have proceeded in terms of some of its own delegation of authority, and how did they reach compromise? Because we are called to compromise. That's part of the peace that we have to bring within our assemblies. So I'm going to take some questions. I'm going to try to answer them here as best I can. So, question from Dorothea. Every state has its own constitution. So when an assembly starts to go through their own constitution, how can we then unravel the Constitution where to start understanding wording? Well, Dorothea, you see, every state does have its own constitution, but as you learned throughout what I was reading, there are certain federal laws that have to be taken into consideration within those constitution, laws of the land, right? And so when we do our state constitutions, we have to think about that. Now, Ohio is kind of in a conundrum with state constitution. And doing some constitutional research, we found out that our 1802-1803 Constitution was never actually ratified by Congress. And it was ratified by people, but it wasn't ratified by Congress in that time period. Later on in 1851, they redid the Constitution to be more in tune with the incorporated model of governance. And it was ratified by Congress, by the delegates, but it was never ratified by Congress or the people. So effectively, Ohio really doesn't have a valid constitution. It wasn't until 1951 100 years later that they discovered that Ohio didn't have a valid constitution. So they quickly had Congress ratify it in 1951. All right. That's a little late out of the gate, legally and lawfully, right? So there's going to be some constitutional questions that come up regarding that. And Ohio might have the absolute opportunity to rewrite their constitution. So we have to begin to understand, and this is part of why we're going back and looking at the 1787 Constitution and eventually the 1790 and 1789 and the 1790, because we have to know what it is that we're delegating and what we're retaining to the states and then retaining to the people, because there's 3 levels that go on within it. So, our constitutions may not be so as eloquently and oldly worded, but they can be plainly stated in a way that we've learned so many things about what's a great way to go about government, especially what we don't want, right? So the question becomes more about understanding those words to put in there what we don't want, and making sure that what we do want is in our constitutions as well. And that's about as best of an answer I can give you. Okay. All right. So does the speaker have more of a voice within an assembly over any other man or woman in the assembly? Can the speaker veto a decision that a committee has made? Well, I can tell you, we do not have the power of veto. A speaker is simply, and Leanne, you need to go back and review again some of the jobs and descriptions that we did in setting up our General Assembly. In the General Assembly portions of America, some assembly required, because the speaker only really guides the meetings, and the speaker speaks whatever the General Assembly tells them to speak. Now, as chairman of the General Assembly, we do guide, we do watch over the issues that come to the floor. We help bring those decisions and monitor those meetings. And yes, we have some very small delegated powers, but veto is not one that we have. Okay. My vote counts no more than anyone else's. And most of the time, my vote is as chairman of the Ohio Assembly is reserved until the very end of a vote on assembly issues. And that's done so that my vote is actually a tiebreaker vote, same as any chairman in any of the committees. Now, I do have people who address the dual role of chairman and speaker incorrectly. Your speaker is only a speaker when they have something to speak that your assembly has told them to speak. So just recently, we had to do letters to the World Health Organization. And in that, I sign as chairman and speaker and head of state, because our citizens got together and said, we reject everything the World Health Organization is proposing. And in that moment, I'm told as speaker to go out and speak. But when I'm in assembly and I'm in my assembly meetings, I should be addressed as chairman. And in that, I help direct the business of the General Assembly itself. And the same that chairman of other assemblies direct the business of that assembly. All right. But they really don't have any more voice than that. Now, some of us who are chairman, and I admit that my voice can be loud, right? But that doesn't mean that it's not a voice that only hears its own. It's tasked with hearing the voice of the other people. and being able to apply that and help bring consensus, that compromise, that great compromise to the people on our states. So I'm there as kind of the negotiator in a way that helps make progress happen throughout our assembly meetings. Okay. All right. All right. Let's see. Can an assembly member chair the General Assembly and a second assembly? For example, international business. So actually, those are supposed to be completely separate positions. So they have to pick one or the other. They can't be publicly elected to both positions as chair. Chairman of the General Assembly and the chairman of the, say, International Business Assembly, those have to be separate people to be able to, it would be, first of all, it's too big of a job to actually be both. Once we really get rolling, once our assemblies really get rolling. Now, in the meantime, if you don't have someone who can handle or is the International Business Assembly chairman, doesn't raise their hand, then the chairman of the General Assembly can pro tem, but they can't be publicly elected to that position as well as the General Assembly chairman. Okay. And in order for your assembly to stand, you have to have a General Assembly chairman along with your other publicly elected positions. And so, but again, the General Assembly chair can stand in until someone raises their hand who is eligible, an eligible citizen to take over the International Business Assembly. That can't be a Federation employee. They have to be a full citizen. They can't have LLCs or any type of corporations, conflicts of interest, or licenses, like a real estate license, a insurance license, or work for the federal government. So, yeah, it's really publicly elected. You can only have the public election of your chairman, and then you have a pro tem election of your international business. All right. So let's see. Can conventions also be, is that seating as an assembly? No, because the conventions are electors from or delegates from each of your assemblies. So in the states here, Dorothea, we would have say 2 or 3 delegates from each state assembly go into constitutional convention. And that's to be able to evenly go about change in terms of our overall decisions when it comes to constitutional conventions. Okay. All right. Right. So Betty Chersleski says, does the Constitution replace the Articles of Confederation? Yes, absolutely it does. And again, one of the main flaws of the Articles of Confederation was the fact that it didn't really allow for any kind of effective growth or change. And secondly, there was not enough in it in the original agreement of the Articles that made it enforceable upon the states. So that was the two major flaws with the Articles of Confederation. Okay. All right. All right. Well, we've come down to the end of our questions. We're an hour and 15 minutes into session here. And so next week, hopefully there may be a change of time and day. And so, please be watching for that change of time and day. And we're going to try to accommodate Anna best we can so we can get her back on. She wants to be here. She wants to be with you all. And we'll be working on the Bill of Rights. So very interesting today. I was starting to do some research and some learning myself. And I asked the question of an artificial intelligence site that I use. And I asked them to give me detail about each of the Bill of Rights, its intent, its historical content. And then I asked it to tell me to whom did the Bill of Rights apply, and from whom did it apply? And the answer was pretty amazing. It said it applied originally to the federal government, that now it applies to the federal government and the municipal government. And it was about them and how they treated us as we work for them. So that's going to be an interesting dive into the Bill of Rights next week. We'll start into that and we'll finish it up, and then we'll go forward with where Anna wants to go. So thank you all for coming. I hope I didn't bore you too much with this, and we will see you next week sometime. Have a nice week.